Hello, today we're going to be taking a look at Judith Jarvis Thomson's very excellent article, A Defense of Abortion. It's another super famous, much anthologized paper in abortion. It's one of the most famous there is, along with Don Marquis's Why Abortion is Immoral. Uh, and it presents a kind of, a different take, right, on the morality of abortion with its own very interesting and specific method. So Judith Jarvis Thomson here is the author. This is a fairly recent picture. Thomson is, of course, a major figure in ethics. You'll remember we started off the entire semester reading a paper of hers. So she's really made a lot of really significant contributions. One of the better minds over the last number of decades in ethics. She's currently, and for most of her career, has been at MIT. She's currently in a named professorship. That's always a good thing. She is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at MIT. So it's you know it's a really good post, right? If you're in a named position, that's always a good thing in the academic world. All right, so let's then get to her actual account. So one of the things that really distinguishes her account in this article and in many others is, I think, something she does possibly better than anybody, certainly as well as anybody, is this idea of parallel reasoning. Okay, so here's the idea behind parallel reasoning. Sometimes it's easier to show that an argument is good or bad by comparing it to another argument. That's what a parallel argument is. That is more obviously good or more obviously bad, right? So if you have an argument, you're like, that kind of sounds all right, but I'm suspicious about it. The idea is if you can take another argument that has, the same features and everything, and you can show that if that new argument that is so similar to the one you're not sure about is really obviously good or really obviously bad, then that should increase your confidence about saying whether the first one was good or bad. And that's very useful in ethics. Okay, and so a parallel argument is going to have to retain the same structure, okay, and other relevant features of the argument that you're making the parallel argument to. And ideally, this new argument, the parallel one, should be more obviously good or bad than the original. Okay. And so here's a couple of examples of parallel reasoning, right, and how it sort of makes something that sounds like a reasonably convincing argument or sounds like that might be okay, and it sort of illustrates the trouble. Okay, so for example, if someone says, if I had a higher salary, I could buy more things. So if everyone had higher salaries, everyone could buy more things, right? And again, that's compelling enough that I think everybody, by the time they're 5, comes up with it at least once and says, gosh, if there's not enough money, just give people more money, right? Well, a parallel argument would be, look, if one person stands up at a ball game, he will get a better view. So if everyone stands up at a ball game, everyone gets a better view, right? And you can see, I see the issue there. So because that second argument is more obviously problematic, like the problem with the argument is more obvious in the second example than the first one, that's a successful parallel argument. You'll notice it shares the same structure and some of the same relevant features. It just sort of, puts the point in a light that makes it more clear what the problem is. Same with this one. This one was a very common when I was, for years ago. Saw a lot of bumper stickers or whatever. So this one says, if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, right? And I mean, that's trivially true, right? But if you put it in a parallel, it starts to become clear that it shouldn't be all that convincing of anything. So the idea is, if gum is outlawed, only outlaws will have gum. Well, again, that's trivially true. The idea was that the gun lobby here was trying to sort of make people sort of afraid that if there were more strict gun controls, notice nobody was even talking about outlawing them, that only like bad guys would have guns or something like that. But that's as weird as saying, look, if there was a law against gum, then only bad guys would have gum. Well, that's not. No, I mean it's simply trivially true that if something's against the law, then doing that thing makes one a lawbreaker. That it's like if we have speed limits, then everyone's going to be violating us. Everyone's going to be a criminal or something like that. And it's like, well, kind of. I mean, I don't know. So again, the parallel very clearly sort of illustrates what the trouble with the original argument is, if the trouble isn't obvious in the original. Okay, so when we evaluate parallel reasoning, here's what we look for. First off, is the parallel argument actually good or bad, right? Is it Is it sound or unsound? What's the actual quality of the parallel, right? What are we supposed to say transits to the original argument? Does the parallel argument really have the same form as the original? So if not, then the application of the parallel reasoning will be unsuccessful. So the parallel argument has to actually be parallel, right? It has to share the form, right? Um, and so when we use parallel reasoning in ethics, it's a very useful tool, okay? Because there's a lot of things in ethics we're just not really sure about, but if we can compare them to some things we're more sure about, we can make a kind of progress, right? Uh, and so what we look for is we look for things that are sort of relevantly similar to especially new situations in ethics, which we see all the time. So one thing in the not too terribly distant past is this idea of downloading copyrighted electronic music. Okay, that's been one of the things that's been kind of a new. It's a newish issue, right? It was an issue that prior to its being technologically feasible was not an issue that anybody wondered about. So the idea is that you start searching for a parallel. So you say, okay, what's it most like, right? Things that we are pretty sure about, okay? Uh, and so you saw a couple of different attempts at parallels there with the way that worked. So one of those parallel was about you say, well, look, downloading copyrighted electronic music, it's like dipping a glass of water from a river that you don't own, or something like that, where that like technically it might violate some kind of a law, but it doesn't seem wrong in any way, right? It seems like a mere technicality, because again, what's somebody going to miss that water, right? I mean, it's just flowing, right? Even if you don't necessarily own the river, just taking a bit out of it. And so in some sense, right, the downloading copyrighted music is like dipping a glass of water from a river you don't own. In some sense, it is like that. And if that seems perfectly okay, then it seems like downloading copyrighted electronic music should be just fine. On the other hand, you might say, okay, there are others who said, no, it really is just like taking somebody's property from their home, in the sense that if you have something that you couldn't have gotten legitimately, right, other than by paying somebody for it, and if you now have it and you didn't pay that person for it, right, you are unjustly enriched, right, by having this thing that is valuable, and it's a originator or a gatekeeper or whatever, a copyright holder, is not compensated for that. And so it does seem, at least in that sense, like taking somebody else's property from their home. As it turns out, we've reached a sort of, society in general has moved toward something like a compromise position, like but in any case, the point is that these kinds of analogies are helpful in thinking through especially new ethical situations, or ethical situations that we're not entirely sure about. Right? It helps us try and figure out, by comparing it to things we are more sure about, like what's it really more like here, right? So it's a tried and true method. And so Thomson's approach is going to begin by addressing the most strict forms of the arguments for the moral impermissibility of abortions. That is, her account is in some sense defensive in structure, right? She'll say, okay, let's take a look at this argument. Now, what's wrong with this, right? Let's really start thinking critically about this particular argument. Then she'll imagine a modification, say, okay, how about this one now? Is this any better, right? And so that's how her discussion goes, and how it should be read. And I again want to bring up a couple of notable features, some things that you should absolutely notice when you read this through. First off, personhood, just like it didn't have anything to do with Marquis's article, it has nothing to do with this one, right? In fact, Thomson is just going to say, look, for the sake of argument, assume that a fetus is a person or a human or whatever you want it to be, okay? Full personhood, full humanhood, full whatever. From the moment of conception doesn't matter, right? She's just going to say, yeah, just assume that. It's not going to make any difference to the ethics of the situation. This is, again, typically the reverse of the way that people tend to argue in sort of, public discourse and, on the news or whatever. That, the one side will say, oh, no, it's a person or it's a human or something. And they'll say, it's not a person, it's not a human, and again, it's totally irrelevant. Marquis will say, yeah, fine, it's not a human, I don't care, abortion's still wrong. And Thompson's going to say, yeah, fine, it's a human, it's a person, it's whatever you want, and it's still permissible. So again, and also just like Marquis's article, religious reasoning likewise makes no appearance whatsoever, again for reasons that are made clear all the way back in the Euthyphro dialogue. So let's get on to her account. So she's going to start by taking a look at this particular argument. Okay, she says, as a quote from the text, every person has a right to life, so the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. The fetus may not be killed, and an abortion then may not be performed. Okay, straightforward enough. You've probably heard something like this before. And so for a parallel argument, she brings up what is probably one of the most famous thought experiments in all of ethics, and so you should know about it, right? So when somebody talks about the violinist or whatever, you're like, oh, even if you don't remember that it was Judith Jarvis Thomson, you should remember the context and all that stuff, but also remember it was Judith Jarvis Thomson, give her some credit. Okay, so here's how she puts it, right? This is on page 335, and you can refer to it if you need. So she says, it sounds plausible, but now let me ask you to imagine this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it had we known. But still, they did it, and the violinist now is plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to this situation? No doubt it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness. But do you have to do it? What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years or longer still? What if the director of the hospital says, tough luck, I agree, but you've got now to stay in bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life, because remember this. Okay, and this is where it most clearly becomes a parallel argument. All persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body, so you cannot ever be unplugged from him. I imagine you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with that plausible-sounding argument I mentioned a moment ago. Right? Very, very a well-targeted parallel argument. Again, I think that that everyone would concede to say, okay, yeah, if I woke up in such a situation, that would be I would find that outrageous. I would say, no, disconnect me from this guy, right? Nobody had my permission to do this. And this argument that, oh no, his right to life outweighs your right to decide what to do to your body. You say, look, nobody asked me. This is not done with my permission. You can't just kidnap people and use their kidneys. That's again, that seems pretty clear. And so what that means is that, again, there must be something wrong with the argument that we saw earlier, if in this case it looks so obviously wrong. And so there's an additional parallel going on here, and I want you to notice that this violinist case, right, the case of the violinist, at least as presented initially, is also parallel to cases of involuntary pregnancy, right? This is, I think it's pretty clear that you can see the parallels between somebody who finds themselves pregnant due to, say, for example, rape, but I put involuntary pregnancy in here. Rape is, I think, the first case to come to mind of that sort of thing, but it's not certainly the only case. You might have, cases of someone sabotaging birth control or doing some other form of fraud that ends up in a pregnancy, and that seems to be the same kind of an issue. Okay, and so that's certainly something to notice. That this kind of case seems to be targeted by the violinist thought experiment. Now, here's the thing about that. You could take this argument that we saw before, right? It says, okay, look, everyone has a right, of course, to decide what happens in and to their body. Nobody would deny that. But, the right to life is going to outweigh that right, and so you can't perform an abortion, right? Certainly you could build in an exception for involuntary pregnancies, but the exceptions seem pretty unprincipled, right? And what I mean by that is that you might say, okay, look, everybody has a right to life. unless you were the result of, your existence as the result of a rape or some other form of involuntary pregnancy, right? And I mean, yes, that technically builds an exception into the argument, but why? Right? Again, that's what I mean by it seems unprincipled, right? There doesn't seem to be any good reason why that should be an exception, right? Why not? Oh, well, uh, everyone has a right to life except those who are, going to be born redheaded or something like that. I mean, it seems just that arbitrary to me. So so again, yeah, you could build an exception in for there, but that exception seems to be pretty unprincipled. And that exception, building in an exception, doesn't address the fundamental problem with the original argument. Again, the original argument just said categorically the right to life always outweighs a right for someone to decide what happens in and to their body. And that doesn't seem right when we look at it through the lens of the violinist case. Right. So what Thomson's going to do is going to modify the case and look at another sort of version of it, or look at something else that often goes with this argument, and see where we go from there. And so one way that somebody might decide to try and get around this one is to say something like, abortion will kill the fetus, right? But in a different kind of a case that is often another type of exception, you say, well, then not aborting simply lets the mother die, or something like that, right? And since killing is worse than letting die, which there's a passage on 337 I want to draw your attention to, that therefore abortion is impermissible. Okay, so. Okay, we're dealing with, in this case, a second kind of very common exception that people tend to make in cases of abortion. They say, okay, look, I think abortion is wrong, except in cases where the life of the mother is threatened, or in cases of rape or other serious injustice, right? And this is the part that Thomson now deals with. She says, okay, look, one way that sometimes people don't even allow this exception is by looking at something like this kind of an argument. And she says on page 337, she says, there are a variety of ways in which this might be continued, this idea that killing is worse than letting die. She might say, number one is, as directly killing an innocent person is always an absolutely impermissible and abortion may not be performed. Or two, as directly killing an innocent person is murder, and murder is always an absolutely impermissible and abortion may not be performed. Or three, as one's duty to refrain from directly killing an innocent person is more stringent than one's duty to keep a person from dying, an abortion may not be performed. Or 4, if one's only options are directly killing an innocent person or letting a person die, one must prefer the letting the person die, and thus an abortion may not be performed, etc. Right? So you should phrase it however you want, right? It's going to end up having the same kind of structure and conclusion. So there's the argument, and again, Thomson is going to construct a parallel that's supposed to shed some light on just how good this argument is or not. So she puts it this way: she's like, look, if anything in the world is true, it is that you do not commit murder, you do not do what is impermissible if you reach around to your back and unplug yourself from that violinist to save your life. Right. So just imagine that, it says, okay, look, being plugged into this violinist will eventually kill you or threaten to kill you. But look here, if we continue, let this continue, right, that's just letting you die. Right. But if we unplug him, we're actually killing the violinist. So you got to stay plugged in even if you'll die. Again, that sounds absurd. If you reach around yourself, you unplug yourself, you're that you're doing something, like if you're committing murder or doing something impermissible. That sounds like a plain old case of something like self-defense. Okay, and so what we can do is we can add to the violinist case in this sense, this sort of extra parallel argument that she adds from page 338, the tiny house case. And here's how this one goes. She says, suppose you find yourself trapped in a tiny house with a growing child. I mean, a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child. You are already up against the wall of the house, and in a few minutes you'll be crushed to death. The child, on the other hand, won't be crushed to death. If nothing is done to stop him from growing, he'll be hurt. But in the end, he'll simply burst open the house and walk out a free man. Now, I could well understand if a bystander were to say, there's nothing we can do for you. We cannot choose between your life and his. We cannot be the ones to decide who is to live. We cannot intervene. But it cannot be concluded that you too can do nothing, that you cannot attack it to save your life. However innocent the child may be, you do not have to wait passively while it crushes you to death. Perhaps a pregnant woman is vaguely felt to have the status of a house to which we don't allow the right of self-defense, but if the woman houses the child, it should be remembered that she is a person who houses it. So again, this is a simple, I think another reasonable parallel would be any other kind of a self-defense parallel. It seems like certainly you shouldn't be allowed to do just whatever is necessary to save your own life. I think there are probably some things that are beyond even that, but you know, but killing even an innocent person to save your own life doesn't necessarily seem to be obviously morally incorrect. And so then, of course, the argument goes this way, right? The person arguing for the impermissibility of abortion might say this. They say, well, look, it may be permissible to kill in self-defense, right? But a third party may do nothing in such a case because killing is impermissible if it is not in self-defense. And so a mother may abort herself to save her life, but may not seek assistance to do the same. All right, they might say, okay, fine, you know, we'll grant you could reach behind yourself to unplug the violinist, but you couldn't have somebody unplug the violinist for you. Okay, well, that might sound plausible enough, but again, uh, Thomson has some parallels here. Okay, now look, ordinary cases of self-defense, if we're just on that metaphor, really do permit assistance from a third party, right? So in general, in a court of law, if it's a very clear case where you even killed somebody, in order to save the life of somebody who was defenseless, who could not, right, defend themselves, you'll in most cases, that should be considered to be justified, right? In any case, if we're thinking not just the law but morality, it seems like that should be morally permitted, right? That you could even go up to as far as killing in the defense of the defenseless. And of course, you can bring in the tiny house case, right? You can say, look, say some third party comes along and they say, oh, look, we can't choose between you and this child. You're like, look, this is my house, right? You can absolutely choose between the two. It's not neutrality. And she also introduces this sort of two coats case on page 339. And here's how it goes. She says, certainly, it lets us see that a third party who says, I cannot choose between you, is fooling himself if he thinks this is impartiality. And here's the example. If Jones has found and fastened upon a certain coat which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, then it is not impartiality that says, I cannot choose between you, when Smith owns the coat. Women have said again and again, this body is my body, and they have reason to feel angry, reason to feel that it has been like shouting into the wind. So again, if Smith and Jones both say fasten upon a certain coat and they both need it to survive, but like if it's Smith's coat, it seems like a third party could absolutely come to Smith's aid and say, look, it really is this guy's coat. You have to give it to him, Jones, no matter how much you need it. And so again, we can modify, right, the anti-abortion argument. You might say, okay, look, the right to the life of the fetus is stronger than any right of the mother except her own right to life, except in cases of involuntary pregnancy. So notice we've just sort of built in a couple of principles here, right, or a couple of modifications. How principled they are, I'll leave you to judge for yourself. But we've gone ahead and built them in. So let's see where this argument takes us. And so finally, we get to what I think is a real central issue here, and one of the things that makes Thomson's article so interesting. So as we discussed earlier in the course, during the unit on non-consequentialist morality, and just after Kant, the right to life is ambiguous, right, between two different kinds of rights, right? There is certainly the negative right to life, which is the right not to be killed, right? The negative right, right, comes from the duty of everybody not to kill you, okay? So if you have a right not to be killed, it's because everybody has the duty not to kill you. That's the sense in which that's a negative duty, and so a negative right comes from a negative duty. That's different than the positive right, which is the right to be kept alive. The positive right comes from a positive duty. If somebody has a duty to keep you alive, then you have the right to be kept alive. Okay, and so that's ambiguous. We want to disambiguate those two things. And so if the claim then is that the fetus has a positive right to life, that is, if the fetus has a right to be kept alive, Thomson responds with the Henry Fonda case, which begins on page 399 or 339. And it goes this way, right? She says, for we should now at long last ask what it comes to have a right to life. In some views, having a right to life includes having a right to be given at least the bare minimum one needs for continued life. That's the positive right to life. But suppose that what in fact is the bare minimum a man needs for continued life is something he has no right at all to be given. If I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast to provide it. It would be less nice, though no doubt well meant, if my friends flew out to the West Coast and carried Henry Fonda back with them. But I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. So Henry Fonda is the name of an actor from the days of yore that you've never heard of, but at once upon a time, famous actor. If you've heard of Jane Fonda, this is, I believe, her father. In any case, that's it's neither here nor there, right? So again, imagine that so the cool touch of some famous actor's hand on your fevered brow is all you need to survive, right? Even so, even if you do your very life requires it, it seems like you don't have any right to it anyway. Okay, and that's going to be a very important parallel case here, right? Even if what the fetus needs is the continued use of its mother's body, it doesn't necessarily mean it has a right to that. And again, the Henry Fonda case is nicely parallel. And if you saw that also the Violinist case had the same parallel, right, where they talked about her friends, she talked about her friends going out to the West Coast to bring Henry Fonda back, right? This is very much in the case of abducting somebody to plug the Violinist in with them, into them, right? And so we can add that as another parallel case. And so we can then move on, right? So if the claim is instead that the fetus has simply a negative right to life, that is the right not to be killed, which, we might say that's pretty stringent, right? That doesn't require any special promise necessarily. Well, then here is Thomson's response, and it's a fairly sophisticated response. So, put on your thinking caps and keep following along carefully. She introduces the chocolates case on page 341. This is how it goes. She says, suppose a boy and his small brother are jointly given a box of chocolates for Christmas. If the older boy takes the box and refuses to give his brother any of the chocolates, he is unjust to him, for the brother has been given a right to half of them. But suppose that, having learned that otherwise it means 9 years in bed with that violinist, you unplug yourself from him. You surely are not being unjust to him, for you gave him no right to use your kidneys, and no one else can have given him any such right. But we have to notice that in unplugging yourself, you are killing him, and violinists, like everyone else, have the right to life, and in the view that we're considering just now, the right not to be killed. So here you do what he supposedly has a right that you shall not do. But you do not act unjustly to him in doing it. The emendation which may be made at this point is this. The right to life consists not in the right not to be killed, but rather in the right not to be killed unjustly. Okay? Because there are killings and there are killings. I mean, it's one thing to just simply, shoot somebody, right? And that kills them. It's another thing to kill them by, say, for example, unplugging yourself from them, despite the fact that they need the use of your organs to survive. And it seems like, again, if the way that you kill them is by denying them something that they didn't have a right to begin with, it doesn't seem clear that you've done anything wrong. So in the violinist case, if you unplug yourself from the violinist, even though we have to grant the violinist has the right not to be killed, it does seem like you can act rightly while killing the violinist. Because what's going on is that all you're doing is denying the violinist something that the violinist didn't have a right to begin with, right? And so again, it's not so much that the negative right to life is the right not to be killed simpliciter, it's the right not to be killed unjustly, right? And Thomson mentions there's some risk of circularity here, but never mind. And I agree, I don't think it affects her account in this case. And so then somebody might come back, right? Say, look, but if somebody, right, if someone invites someone else into one's house, okay, and we're going to use house as a kind of metaphor here still, then one has granted that person certain rights. And that's true enough. And so that is, a pregnancy resulting from a voluntary act grants the fetus the right to the use of the mother's body, and thus it would be unjust if that were taken away. And so there's a real question then. Is the fetus's presence like the box of chocolates that really was given jointly to both boys, or is it like the violinist who was not given the right to the use of the mother's body? What's it like? Is there some implicit act of giving permission to use the mother's body that, and resulting in a pregnancy? And that seems plausible, at least for voluntary pregnancies, right? So if somebody voluntarily has sex and becomes pregnant, then it seems like, since they knew that could easily happen, then they really have given the right to the use of their body, and then this certainly the negative right to life applies, right? You can't withdraw that then. Okay, better argument than the one we started with, certainly. But then, of course, Thomson has some parallel cases for this one as well to try and make it clear what's really going on. And so on page 342 to 3, she introduces what she calls the burglar case, okay? And it goes this way. She says, "We should also notice that it is not plain at all what this argument really, that this argument really does go even as far as it purports to. For there are cases and there are cases, and the details make a difference. If the room is stuffy, and I therefore open a window to air it, and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She's given him a right to the use of her house, for she is partially responsible for his presence there, having voluntarily done what enabled him to get in full knowledge that there are such things as burglars, and that burglars burgle. It would be still more absurd to say this if I had had bars installed outside my windows precisely to prevent burglars from getting in, and a burglar got in only because of a defect in the bars. It remains equally absurd if we imagine that it is not a burglar who climbs in, but an innocent person who blunders or falls in." Okay, so let's stop there for a second, and we'll get to the second half of this parallel case here in a minute. But again, notice what this is parallel to. So again, it's parallel to the argument about people's rights. It says, look, just because somebody finds their way into your house doesn't mean that they have the right to stay there or use your house, right? Even if you did something voluntarily that is partially responsible for their being there. And I think the burglar case in that sense is very well chosen. But notice what she says. She's like, look, imagine I put bars on the window and there was a defect in the bars, right? And that looks like very ordinary cases of unwanted or unplanned pregnancies, right? Or pregnancies due to failures of birth control measures, things like that. You can see those sort of parallels in those cases. And she sort of goes on, right, to talk about this sort of people seeds case. She says, suppose it were like this. People seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpets or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best you can buy. As can happen, however, and on very, very rare occasions does happen, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to the use of your house? Surely not. Despite the fact that you voluntarily opened your windows, you knowingly kept carpets and upholstered furniture, and you knew that screens were sometimes defective. Someone may argue that you are responsible for its rooting, that it does have a right to your house, because after all you could have lived your life with bare floors and furniture, or with sealed windows and doors. Again, think of what parallel that is to, right? But this won't do, for by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy, or anyway, by never leaving home without a reliable army. And so again, I think you see that these parallel cases indicate that perhaps the argument that this voluntary act gives a fetus the negative right to life, or the right to the continued use of its mother's body, doesn't really hold up as well as it seemed to in these other cases. Now, I will say this. I think that Thomson has gone a little bit overboard with the people seeds case. Okay, remember the point of parallel reasoning. The point of parallel reasoning is to present a case that's more clearly good or more clearly bad than the original, so that you can learn something about the original case. So you can learn something about a case you're not as sure of by comparing it to a case that you're a lot more sure of, right? And I honestly don't know what to make about people seeds drifting through the air and taking root in upholstery. That's too alien to me to really, I think, clarify the situation. However, I think we can adapt something she says a little earlier. Remember, at the end of the burglar case, she says, it remains equally absurd if we imagine that it is not a burglar who climbs in, but an innocent person who blunders or falls in. So again, imagine we don't have necessarily like people's seeds drifting through the air, but we do have our hapless, innocent people perhaps wandering through the world. I like to call this the Magu case, right? And this is a picture of the cartoon Mr. Magoo. You might be familiar with it. If not, just look it up on YouTube. I'm sure somebody has put some Mr. Magoo up somewhere. But the idea is that it's this old man who's, sort of mostly blind and mostly deaf, but he goes on his walk and he ends up, sort of toddling with his little cane through all these horribly dangerous situations where like cars just barely miss him and he just barely gets redirected before walking off of a cliff, or when walking across the edge of a construction zone manages to sort of walk on an I-beam just as it swings by and get deposited off in another safe place, and then he always ends up right back home, completely safe and sound, despite all these tremendous near misses and lucky escapes, and he's none the wiser. It's funny, right? And so again, just imagine instead of the burglar case where the burglar is essentially guilty of something, right? Just imagine the Magoo case, right? Where just imagine somebody does, despite every precaution you've taken, manage to stumble into your house. Okay, again, imagine you don't even have any upholstery, right? But they manage to stumble into your house. Do they have a right to stay there? Right. And again, imagine that it's like, say, so cold outside that if you sort of, kick them out of your house, they'll die. Do they still have the right to stay in your house? And I think it seems pretty clear that the answer is no. And that proves what essentially Thomson's point here. That so let's if we look at it sort of in retrospective at all these parallel cases and how they stack up, it seems like she has made a fairly strong case, right, for saying that look, I mean, it's just not the case that somebody's right to life does really outweigh somebody else's right to decide what happens in and to their bodies. And in fact, it doesn't seem like the right to life even outweighs somebody's right to decide what happens in and to their houses, right? To say much less, their bodies, right? So that's interesting. Okay, that's an interesting part of her article. And so again, such cases do demonstrate that the right to life does not generally entitle us to that which we have not been explicitly given. So at this point, Thomson adds something to her account that turns it from a really good paper in ethics to, I think, a truly great paper in ethics, right? And in philosophy in general, is that she says, okay, the story is more complicated than I've made it sound in talking about just whether an abortion is morally permissible or isn't morally permissible. And in order to address this extra complexity, she's going to appeal to this concept that she calls minimally decent Samaritanism, which is linguistically a little confused, but it fits with the way a lot of people use the term. So a lot of times when people talk about good Samaritanism or something like that, what they mean is something like good citizenship and helping other people and all that stuff. But that, in some sense, loses the context of the original reference. Of course, the original reference is from the New Testament. It's from a story of that Jesus tells. And people are, of course, this is the context is that somebody asks Jesus what he thinks the most important commands of God are, and Jesus says something like, oh well, to love God with all your heart and soul, and also to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So he says something like that, and somebody then says, well, who's my neighbor, right? And then Jesus tells this story of the Good Samaritan. Now, if you want, I'm sure you can go and you can search YouTube, and I'm sure you can find somewhere within an order of magnitude of 10,000 sermons on the Good Samaritan story, and many of them will say something like this, right? So sometimes it's hard to appreciate the story given that we don't always appreciate its historical context, right? The Samaritans were not well beloved by the people of ancient Judea, or at least not by the Judeans, right? People from, say, Galilee, like Jesus was, and some of the people he's talking to were, right? So Samaritans were, society didn't really trust them so much. And so the idea of the story is this, right? So the story goes, somebody is waylaid on the by robbers and sort of left to die on the side of the road after being sort of robbed and beaten. And one person sort of comes by and does nothing, and another person comes by and does nothing. But who those people are is pretty important to the story. So to translate it into something like a modern metaphor, imagine that like you're sort of the chairperson of your local Rotary Club comes and walks and sees this person in trouble and sort of crosses the other side of the street and walks on by without doing anything, right? So I mean they lead a charitable organization, right? You'd expect they would be the person who would stop and help, right? They didn't. And then you might imagine like a local minister, a church, a person of the cloth, right, comes by and they see this person outside the road and they kind of cross the other side of the street and walk on by and don't do anything. And again, they're the sort of person that you would expect to do something, but they don't. And then, right, the Samaritan comes by, or again, pick anybody that you think that society doesn't trust, like say, some extremist terrorist, or some left wing or right wing crazy, or some Soviet communist, or again, pick your favorite example of somebody you don't think that society trusts, right? And they're the person, they're coming up and they see this person by the side of the road and they say, oh my goodness. And so they go and they bandage the wounds and they take the person to an inn and they pay the innkeeper and they say, look, I'm going to give you a bunch of money, you take care of this person, give them a place to stay, nurse them back to health, and whatever you spend more than that, I'll come back and I'll pay you when I pass this way again. And then Jesus of course asks, who was this guy's neighbor, right? And of course, it's gasp, the Samaritan, right? The filthy Samaritan that was the neighbor to this person. So again, the point that Thomson is going to be making, appealing to this kind of a concept, is to be saying something different than I think what Jesus was saying. Jesus was perhaps saying, you ought to do more than morality requires of you, or perhaps morality requires a lot more than you think it does of you, or something like that, right? One of those things might be plausible. Thomson is going to say, look, I mean, aside from going above and beyond the call of moral duty, or aside from living up to this sort of heroic moral ideal, she wants to talk about sort of the minimally decent Samaritan. It's like, what's the least that this person could do and still have some shred of decency, right? And so she's going to use this to address this real gray area between sort of permissible and impermissible cases of abortion. And so on page 344, she puts it this way, right? She says, there may well be cases in which carrying the child to term requires only minimally decent Samaritanism of the mother, and this is our standard that we must not fall below. I am inclined to think it a merit of my account precisely that it does not give a general yes or a general no. It allows for and supports our sense that, for example, a sick and desperately frightened 14-year-old schoolgirl, pregnant due to rape, may of course choose abortion, and that any law which rules this out is an insane law. And it also allows for and supports our sense that in other cases, resort to abortion is positively indecent. It would be indecent in the woman to request an abortion and indecent in a doctor to perform it if she is in her 7th month and wants the abortion just to avoid the nuisance of postponing a trip abroad. The very fact that the arguments I have been drawing attention to treat all cases of abortion, or even all cases of abortion in which the mother's life is not at stake, as morally on par, ought to have made them suspect at the outset. And so again, I think Thomson here has a very keen appreciation of the kind of gray areas on which she treads, and that there might be some very reasonable disagreements about whether a particular abortion in a particular case really does fall below this level of minimal decency or doesn't. There are some cases that clearly don't fall below that level of decency. There are some cases that clearly do, and that's something that she sort of adds to her account. So again, she's not, arguing that, yes, everyone should have an abortion, yay, or something. Nobody argues that. Nor is she arguing that, no, anybody can have an abortion for any reason whatsoever. She does argue, right? She does point out earlier that certainly it seems within somebody's rights at any given time to have an abortion. But that, again, picture the Magu case where somebody walks into your house, right? If all they need is to stay in your house for 5 minutes and they're going to live, and if you kick them out before then, they're going to die, it seems positively indecent not to just let them stay for 5 minutes, right? But again, there's a point at which there could be a very reasonable disagreement for how much is too much, how much is really unwarranted, how much does rise above the level of mere minimal decency. So here are some of the crucial questions that we certainly want to take a look at. So number one, what kind of a moral theory here does Thomson assume? Okay, that's a real question. Does she have is she talking about duties? Is she talking about rights? Certainly, there's that. Is she talking about consequences? Right. What seems to be the main thrust here? What parallels does she have with other kinds of moral theories? Even if, again, she doesn't necessarily take a particular moral theorist and say, I'm following this one exactly to the T. Which sorts of ideas are most prevalent? What category does her account most clearly fit into? And of course, what areas of overlap are there between Marquis and Thomson? Because there might be more than you'd think, right? Marquis is giving us an argument that abortion is generally very seriously morally wrong, but says, look, there might be many cases where there can be something of comparable moral importance to weigh against the value of a future. Okay, he thinks those things are probably going to be fairly few. But of course, Thomson thinks that, even though many abortions are within a person's rights, um, perhaps most or even all are within a person's rights, that some number of those are sort of indecent, right? Despite being within a person's rights. Um, I mean, again, how much overlap really is there, right? I mean, between these two different theorists, do they both do, for example, agree on having an exception, having the life of the mother being threatened, making the case very different. But yeah, what areas of overlap are there? This is a good critical question to ask. And also, what kind of disagreement is there between Marcus and Thompson? What are the cases that they do, in fact, disagree on? Which are the cases that they don't have sort of this kind of overlap in room?